this chapter, identify security risks in LANs and WANs and design security policies that minimize risks. I think they do a pretty good job of talking about security policies and what they're used for and some of the components of them. Explain how physical security contributes to network security. Physical security tends to be something that the vast majority of textbooks ignore. And it's really interesting, in a sad way, I guess, that they don't address that, because without physical security, virtually every other security mechanism is almost pointless, including encryption, although that's not entirely true, but depends on your encryption. Discuss hardware and design-based security techniques. Understand methods of encryption, such as SSL, IPsec, that secure data in storage and in transit. Describe how popular authentication protocols such as Radius, TACACS, Kerberos, PathChat, and MSChat function. Network operating system techniques to provide basic security, and understand wireless security protocols such as Web, WPA, etc. So I kind of modified the slides a little bit because I thought, at least at the beginning, I wanted to talk about a few things. A few of them are some basic principles about security. And we have to think about data in essentially one of two states. Data is either at rest or it's in motion. And it creates different challenges depending on whether it's at rest or whether it's in motion. It's obviously easier to protect data when it's at rest. We've got a limited scope around wherever our data is located. If it happens to be on backup tapes, those backup tapes need to be secured. When data starts to move, now all of a sudden we have less control over our data. So as a result, the vulnerabilities go way up, the risks go way up. So data at rest versus data in motion is something you kind of need to be familiar with and think about. We also have to think about the CIA triangle: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Confidentiality. Anybody want to take a stab at what that means as it relates to data? It says, yeah, it's intended, whoever this data is intended for is the only person that gets to read it, gets to see that data. Now that may be everyone. It depends on the specific data that you're talking about. It may be one person, one specific individual. Confidentiality says that we're going to share this piece of data with the person or persons that are intended, and only the person or persons that are intended. Integrity says the data that we're going to share is really the data that we're going to share. In other words, it doesn't get modified. It's not modified on our hard drive. It's not modified in transit. It doesn't get changed from when we send it to from where it's received. And then availability, that we have access to our data. We can get to it. There's not a denial of service. We're not being denied our data. So we can access our data when we need it, where we need it. So those are the concepts behind the CIA triangle. So with all of that in mind, we have to look at threats, and we have to be able to respond to those threats with some type of countermeasures. There's a paper back in '92 by Locke et al. That looked at threats, and while threats change over time, they change depending on the industry that you happen to be in. The underlying principle, the underlying framework with which you can use to analyze threats or to look at threats doesn't really change that rapidly. So they developed this framework of looking at human versus non-human threats, purposeful versus non-purposeful, and insider versus outsider threats. So in general, we can classify all threats along these three dimensions. So anybody want to give me an example of a human threat? What about an employee that accidentally types in information wrong? You've now just corrupted the integrity of your database or of that particular organization. That's a person that did it versus a non-human. That happened to be non-purposeful because it was a mistake, and assuming it was an employee, it was an insider. At the same time, you may have an employee, an insider, obviously human, that does it on purpose. Maybe they're about to get fired. Maybe they're trying to manipulate where money's going so that they can make a deposit in their personal account. So if you look at these, you ought to start to, the wheels ought to be turning that. Can they be people? Yeah. They can also be non-human. They can be mechanical. Hard drives fail, right? It's a mechanical device. They fail. that's going to cause a loss of data unless you get a backup or something like that. It certainly causes an inconvenience, some lost productivity, all the hard drives being replaced and the data is being restored. So you can have non-human threats as well. You can have acts of nature, non-human threat, fire, hurricane, etc. So threats really can come from a large variety of sources for a lot of different reasons, things like that. We tend to want to kind of glamorize. We tend to think about hacking and viruses and all those types of things. And those are certainly very real threats, but the reality is there's threats from all over the place. And if you're trying to secure a network, you have to realize that and be able to account for that. Because the reality is, unless you're in a very specific type of situation that is going to put your organization in a position that you're a bigger target, that an attacker might really be interested in your network, chances are you're not going to be targeted. Chances are you're going to probably tend to face hardware failure, things like that more regularly than some of the other types of threats. So those threats we want to address in some fashion. We have to address those threats through some type of countermeasures, some type of technique to protect ourselves from that hardware failure, from that employee accidentally typing things in incorrectly, from that employee typing things in incorrectly on purpose. And one a useful way of looking at that was by using an approach that these two guys ended up coming up with. A guy named Straub is a professor out of Georgia State University. And he's really interested in a concept that came to us from criminology called general deterrence theory. And Straub and Welke in '98 came up with what they refer to as the security action cycle, which had 4 components: deterrence, prevention, detection, and remedy or recovery, on the paper that you're reading at the time. And essentially you can think of countermeasures as one of those 4 classes, if you will, of countermeasures. So we have deterrent type countermeasures. We might put up signs that say we will prosecute if you trespass. We put up banners on our computers when you log in that say unlawful use of this computer system is a violation of state and federal law. We might have prevention countermeasures as well. We put up an actual fence. We block server room doors. We put passwords on our computer. So something physical, something tangible that allows us to prevent unauthorized access to our systems. Assuming that these didn't work, we need to know that some kind of breach occurred, that some kind of issue happened, that the hard drive did fail, that floodwaters did take out the server, things like that. We have to have some kind of ability to detect. So we have computer logs. We have video cameras that we record what's going on in a particular room, things like that. And then recovery or remedies. So with respect to remedies, typically refer to legal action versus recovery is some way to get back to where we were. We can restore from backup tapes. We can fire the employee that was responsible. We can do things like that. So any questions over any of that so far? Okay. So how do we know where our security within our organization stands? Well, we start out with a security audit. It's just basically a way to look at our organization and determine our various weak spots. What is it that we have? What are our assets? What of those assets, what do we really depend on? What we really depend on, if we lose it, what's it going to do to our business? What's the likelihood of losing it? These are all things we have to take into consideration. And that's what the purpose of a security audit is to determine all that. We can perform that audit in-house by our own IT staff, or we can do it by a third party. Preferably, you do it by a third party. Why? Different set of eyes. Think about writing your paper. If you're writing a paper, you look at it over and over and over again, and eventually it gets to the point where, yeah, it looks great. You want to show it to somebody else, get somebody else's input, because you've seen it so much, you can't really, you miss the fact that you didn't put a comma there, or misspelled that word, because it looked right. It's looked right, you've looked at it so much. But that costs money, so in a lot of cases we have our internal staff look at our security, and it's better than nothing. It's something that certainly a lot of organizations do, but ideally you'd have some other group perform some type of security audit. Like we talked about earlier, those risks, those threats that we face come from all different kinds of places, and people are obviously a big one. They say half of all security breaches come from people. Human errors, ignorance, and omissions. People just don't type in the right stuff. You ever go to the store and you're purchasing something and they're supposed to log all your information, and what do? They're in a hurry, they're busy, and they tab through it, and so they don't capture your information. Well, that's convenient for you because you're in and out quicker. It's convenient for them so they can serve more customers. But if you're the manager, if you're the owner of the business, you now have a record in your database that doesn't have a customer associated with it. So your database is of less value. So that is an issue. People, as far as ignorance, a lot of cases comes to us from social engineering techniques. Who's heard of Kevin Mitnick? Oh, guys, come on. Okay. Mr. Kevin Mitnick. He spent some time in jail. He's a very interesting guy. Never broke into computer systems for anything other than the sheer fun of it. Spent some time, quite a few years in prison. One point they would not allow him to talk on the telephone. He was in solitary confinement because they swore he could launch missiles just by whistling into the telephone system. He's a consultant, a computer security consultant. Has written several books, and he's really doing pretty well. And this is why I can't believe nobody's heard of him. He's on Colbert. Before we get to that, one other story I wanted to relate about Kevin Mitnick. At one point, he wiretapped the NSA is one thing that he did. He was also wiretapping the FBI as they were pursuing him. Just as they were getting pretty close to him, to catch him at one point, he realized it, and he ended up leaving in his apartment a box of donuts and left a note on the fridge of the donuts that said FBI donuts. So, I mean, the guy is really good, had a sense of humor, but it's stunts like that that really probably motivated his pursuers, if you will.
Please welcome Kevin Mitnick. Now, you, sir, were once considered the world's most famous hacker. You're the most wanted man in computer crime, correct?
Yes.
Okay, you're a consultant now, but at one time you were, let's see, you bypassed the security systems of Motorola, Sun Microsystems, and Pacific Bell.
Yes, I did.
You served jail time for this. How much?
5 years.
5 years.
And a year in solitary confinement.
Why a year in solitary confinement? You don't look like a dangerous guy.
I'm very dangerous. Now, the prosecutor had told a judge during a bail hearing that I could pick up the telephone and connect to NORAD and whistle the launch codes and launch a nuclear weapon. And because of this, the judge actually had a special order that I would have to be held in prison without access to a telephone. So the only place they could put me was in solitary confinement. So I let
And you do that? Could you do that? Because that would be badass. That would be badass. Now, you've got a book about your experience. It's called Ghost in the Wires, My Adventures as the World's Most Wanted Hacker. How old were you when you started hacking?
I was in high school.
Did you get into hacking for the girls?
Yeah. I should have.
Yeah.
But
why did you start?
well, I was fascinated with the telephone system. I started in a hobby called phone phreaking, and I loved doing magic tricks and pulling pranks. I was a prankster by heart. And as the phone company became more computerized, I wanted to get access to phone company systems to pull pranks. And one of my favorite ones was to change the class of service of a friend's phone to a payphone, so whenever he or his parents try to make a call, it'd say, please deposit 25 cents.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so what did you actually do that got you arrested?
Oh, I hacked into a lot of systems.
Can you talk about this? You seem hesitant to reveal the contents of your book.
No. It's all there.
It's all there.
But I hacked into a lot of systems, and I actually was a fugitive from the government for a number of years.
For 3 years.
For 3 years. And I was playing this cat and mouse game with the FBI, because I must have been a little bit crazy. And as they
were you actually taunting them?
Not taunting them, but I was watching them through the cellular phone system as I was able to work out their telephone numbers, and I hacked into the cell phone system so I could keep track of where they were. So if they got close to me, I would go farther away.
That's a good plan.
It's a really good plan.
How did you finally get caught?
They actually went out with radio direction finding gear and tracked my cellular phone signal to an apartment in Raleigh, North Carolina on Valentine's Day, 1995. So I definitely wasn't hacking for the girls. I was alone behind my computer.
What do you think, if you did what you did today, I'm sure you would put solitary, but...
Guantanamo Bay.
Guantanamo Bay, you think?
Probably. I mean, now that in this post-9/11 world, I think hacking is almost considered a form of terrorism.
But couldn't we use you? Aren't you a weapon? Because the Chinese hack our systems, right?
All the time.
Shouldn't we unleash you on our enemies?
Maybe that's a great idea. I could be the secret weapon of the United States and go after all those hackers that are breaking into RSA and...
But if you were our secret weapon, some other hacker out there could call you up and whistle into his phone and activate you.
I'll turn off my cell phone.
You missed the game?
Well, I actually hack all the time. I haven't quit. So just don't tell anybody.
Well, how do you hack?
Well, just the other day I hacked into this, company's systems and got access to everything, but the only difference was they actually gave me permission ahead of time. They actually gave me a get-out-of-jail-free card so I could hack into their systems to find all their vulnerabilities so they could fix them before the real bad guys get it.
Is there a holy grail of hacking? Like something that the greatest hacker would want to try to get into, but no one's ever been able to do?
I think the holy grail back in my day was hacking into the National Security Agency. And when I was a juvenile, when I was 16 and a half, I actually was able to get into a telephone switch in Laurel, Maryland. And I was able to intercept an ongoing conversation from the NSA's facility in Fort Meade. I just popped on the conversation. I heard a man and a woman talking. And I go, ooh, this is cool, I could really do it. Then I disconnected and never did it again. Just to climb Mount Everest. I wanted to see if I could do it.
Is there any chance that you're just telling me that so you don't do harder jail time?
Possible.
Thank you so much. The book is Ghosts in the Wire.
So, he's written a few books. Ghosts in the Wire is his most recent. Another one he did was called The Art of Deception, and essentially they're the same books. The only difference is Art of Deception came out before he was able to profit from writing about his escapades, and essentially they were hypothetical situations. In Ghost in the Wires, it's actually a biography of himself, and he kind of goes through the whole process. And his real claim to fame, he's a very good hacker of what you traditionally think of as a hacker, knowing code, knowing how to be able to breach systems, knowing what parts of systems to target. His real claim to fame, or his real strength, is this concept of social engineering, though. Being able to manipulate people, being able to read people and identify what makes people tick and what makes people do things that they do. You walk up behind somebody as you're walking through a door, what do you normally do? You hold the door open for somebody behind you. Well, that's fine when you're walking into a public building. If you're walking into a secure site, that's not so cool. You're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to make everybody use their card, swipe into the door so you have controlled access into that facility. He just realized that human nature. People want to be helpful. And as a result, he's certainly able to capitalize and stuff like that. And that's a technique referred to as social engineering. So people really produce an awful lot of risk because of the way we do things. Okay. Risks associated with transmission hardware. Again, when data is in motion, it's at higher risk than when it's at rest, because we have more points that we have to protect now, and so that certainly becomes an issue. A few of the techniques that tend to get used when data is in motion. Man-in-the-middle attack. It's essentially a technique where you have two people that want to communicate. They think they're communicating directly with the other person. Somebody sits in the middle and collects those messages coming in from both sides. They receive them from this side, read it, and then pass it on to the other side. In reverse, they do the same thing. They receive it from this direction, read it, and then pass it on. What's the purpose? Well, they get to read all the communication. If it's not, if it's just me talking to somebody, it's probably not that big a deal. But if it's the NSA, if something like that, you're listening in to presumably some pretty important stuff. Eavesdropping, what Mitnick was just talking about in terms of the NSA. And sniffing, network hubs broadcasting traffic over an entire segment. This is not as big a deal today in our wired networks. Why? Why is that?
It's fiber?
Well, the real answer is, the real issue right here is hubs.
Yeah, we don't use those.
We don't use hubs. We use switches. So we have a point-to-point communication. So you really have to be listening to that specific communication. So it makes it a little bit more difficult. The problem with this is wireless networks logically operate like hubs. So all the data is being broadcast. All the nodes pick it up. They just all ignore it except for the one that's being broadcast to. So that's a security issue. Let's see. Risks associated with internet access. Network security compromise occurs more often from the inside. That used to be something that was preached over and over and over again. Everybody, again, you watch Hollywood films, and you always hear about hackers and it's somebody from the outside trying to break into our systems. And the reality was the biggest threat was from our insiders. Either employees that currently work for us or employees that have just recently left and we didn't bother to disable their accounts or delete their accounts. Because we throw so many of our systems online anymore, that's becoming less and less true. It's still true. It's just not as one-sided as it once was. Because we provide access for everything online anymore, we allow our employees access to their human resource data. We allow customers access to all their order information. So we throw an awful lot of stuff online, and as a result, we face an awful lot of threats from the online environment as well. Risks associated with transmission hardware continued. Port access via port scanners, private address availability, outside router attacks. Some of the more technical types of threats that an organization will face. The advantage to some of these and the disadvantage to some of these are the complexity that it takes to set up some of your networks in some cases. That as you complicate your network, you run into the possibility of having more misconfigured equipment. So the idea is that you want to simplify your network as much as possible while still being able to deliver the services that you want. The advantage on something like this, port access via a port scanner, that's where somebody's just going to listen to a particular communication line and scan a particular IP address for all the various ports that happen to be open on that particular IP address or that particular router. And systems have gotten to the point where they're really good about picking up those port scans and, as a result, breaking off communications with wherever that's being received from. So there are techniques that you can address some of these issues, some technical techniques that you can address some of these issues. But in general, things like this, routers not configured to drop suspicious packets, you want to make sure your network's as simple as possible while still being able to deliver the services that you want. Simple is good. The more complex it is, the more likely you're going to have things that are misconfigured. Security holes. There is a security guy at the University of North Texas that I'm friends with, and he will preach to you that if you will patch your systems religiously, 99.9% of your security issues will be taken care of. But that's the real issues, that people don't patch their systems. They get annoyed with it's downloading another patch, or do you want to do that? That takes away processing time, processing power. Slows your system down. Nah, cancel it, I'll do it later. Same thing with your virus scanner. People shut it down, people update it later, I'll do it later. Well, eventually later happens after the fact. So if you keep your systems patched, the vast majority of the time you're going to be okay. In fact, a lot of the patches that are released are done so. Virus scanners, or virus people that write viruses, for example, will go out and review the code for the patches, and then write viruses based on those patches. Not to take advantage of machines that have applied the patch, but to take advantage of users who refuse to patch their systems. So, be aware. Improperly configured firewalls, telnets or FTPs. There are certain types of connections that broadcast in plain text. FTP, for example. Don't do it. It's a security risk. Same thing with email. I don't know if they put that here. Same thing with email. Email transmits or sends messages in plain text. Do not put your social security number, credit card number, things like that in an email. It will, it's sent in plain text. Anybody that happens to want to listen in on that communication will get that. Now the reality is most of the time nobody's going to listen in on your particular communication, because that's one credit card number, that's one social security number. They really want, business, a bank or something like that, where they can get lots and lots of them. But realize it is a security risk. So how do we address all these various issues? User issues, hackers, obsolescence, all those types of things. Well, some type of security policy to be able to address some of those issues. Let's see if I can video. Just a second. I had one other thing I wanted to. Yeah, we'll come back to that in a minute. Okay, so we address those with some type of an effective, some type of security policy, hopefully an effective one. And the idea is to minimize break-in risk. And we have to do that by communicating with our users, talking to our managers, and identifying those risks that we talked about earlier, and recognizing how much is security worth. Because if you're a network administrator, there is no cost too great. You're protecting your systems, that's the idea. But the reality is for most of us, it's a business solution. Some things are worth losing. Some things are worth data being compromised. If the cost to protect it is too much, you sacrifice that. So to develop a security policy, identify security goals, risks, authority levels, design a designated security coordinator and team members, and the various responsibilities of those team members, and how to address security breaches. So how are you going to respond to a breach when something happens? Not included in the policy. Policy tends to be more generic, so it's not going to specify specific hardware or anything like that. Typical goals that you might see in a security policy: ensure authorized users have appropriate resource access. In other words, that they're not allowed to be denied service. So if somebody launches a denial of service attack, that you have some scheme, some mechanism to be able to protect yourself from that. Prevent unauthorized user access. The people log in are who they say they are, and you don't allow access to others. That video is about that, so we'll come back to that here in a little bit. Protect unauthorized sensitive data access inside and outside. Prevent accidental hardware software damage, intentional hardware software damage. Create a secure environment, and communicate employees' responsibilities. So how do we go about developing a policy for a specific organization? Well, depends on the size of the organization. Obviously, if you're a small organization, it's probably the network admin kind of designates what your security policy is. But as you get larger, you might end up forming some type of committee with various decision makers, And they really have to be tasked with trying to understand all the risks. So they have to bounce ideas off of each other and identify various risks that are associated with the various departments that exist within that organization. And then they can start to address some of the threats. First thing I want to do is outline the policy content. So identify some of the major categories of the policy that they need to. They also need to effectively communicate with users. We tend to want to throw technical measures at security related problems. And that's good in a sense that technical solutions tend to be very effective. The downside is that all it takes is one person to hold that door open. One person to write their password down on a sticky note, and all that money you invested in the technical solutions goes out the window. So what becomes more important is communicating with users, doing periodic training, retraining, keeping users aware of what the security policies are. A lot of users are aware of the security policies, but as time goes away from when they were trained, they kind of go to the backside. They start to forget them, or they don't become a priority anymore. So as a result, they become a little bit lax in their security posture. So periodic training to kind of remind them and bring those ideas about security back to the forefront of their mind is a good thing. It's cheap and very effective. So user communication is really important. Find what confidential data means to the organization. The book in that video that we just got through watching was Kevin Mitnick's biography called Ghosts in the Wires. He has another book, I think this was his first one, called The Art of Deception. And like I mentioned, it's pretty similar to Ghosts in the Wires, except that it was kind of innocuous stunts that he pulled. And they weren't him, they were just somebody that did these in Art of Deception. But what differentiated a little bit was at the very end of the book, he talked about how to address a lot of these issues. And one of them was to define data in your organization in terms of what's important versus what's not important, what's confidential, what's top secret, and categorize information in your organization so you know what's really important, what you can't allow to be released to the public. Coca-Cola, for example, does not want to release their formula for Coke. KFC doesn't want to release their formula for their original chicken or whatever. Excuse me. So you have to identify and be able to categorize different categories of data, the importance of data in your organization. The more categories that your organization has, the more complicated it becomes. So you want to keep it as simple as you can, but at the same time, you want to be able to have very clear distinctions about this is important data that can't be shared externally. This is important data that can only be shared with, say, the CEO and the vice presidents of the organization. And this is information that can be shared with everybody, so that you know how to apply technical controls to those various categories. With your security policy in place, you need to have some sort of response policy. So if something happens, if you happen to have a hurricane that wipes out your data center, how are you going to respond to that? Do you have backup somewhere? Do you have a hot site somewhere? A cold site somewhere? If you have a security that hits your system, what is your response to that? And that's the purpose of the response policy, is to try to address that and think through some of those issues before they happen. The last thing you want to do is kind of shoot from the hip as it's happening. You're not going to get a good result. Team roles in a response policy. Probably ought to have a dispatcher, somebody who, when a problem is discovered, that they disseminate the information. They contact the correct people who say, we've had this issue, we've lost the data center because of the hurricane or tornado or whatever it happens to be. Then you have somebody that takes charge, some type of manager that's responsible for taking charge of that particular issue. Technical support specialist, responsible for trying to fix the problem. And then some type of public relations specialist, especially if you're a larger company and it's a major issue, a major breach, a major loss of some type of resource. You're going to have newspaper reporters, radio stations, etc., that want to talk to you. In some cases, it may be the government. There are certain laws, for example, that you have to comply with. In California, actual definition for it in the law. But it includes things like your driver's license number, etc. If that's lost and it was not in encrypted form, you have to report that data breach to the government. It's required. So you want somebody that's their job, is to make that communication and share that information. And then perhaps most importantly is a review process. What worked? What didn't work? So that you can do a better job the next time something like that happens. Like I mentioned at the very beginning, physical security is something that often gets overlooked. You can have the passwords all you want. I mean, you can have really good passwords and 15 characters or more, uppercase, lowercase, special characters, all that kind of stuff. If somebody walks out the door with the server, they're going to remove that hard drive, boot it with a Linux disk, and you're toast. So you really have to maintain physical security. And it's not just about servers. It's also about your physical facilities as well. I read a thing a while back. It was about somebody who was hacking networks and essentially through social engineering techniques acquired physical access to a building by walking behind employees that were going in the secured door. And once he was into the building, he found an office that it was late at night. He found an office that nobody was in. He went into the back and ended up hooking up a wireless access point to the network. Then left the building. Well, then he had a wireless access point that he could access the network from remotely. And so he could sit there and bang away at the network for however long he wanted to in order to gain access. So physical security is something that tends to be overlooked, but the reality is it's really important. It's something that's really pretty simple. It just tends to kind of get pushed to the wayside because of the more glamorous approaches of firewalls and routers and all this stuff, that intrusion detection and prevention systems. So then they talk about physical security, ID badges and stuff like that. Kevin Mitnick would tell you about ID badges. They just have to be close. 99% of the time, nobody looks at your ID badge. As long as the picture's roughly in the right place, the colors are roughly correct, you're in good shape. So ID badges are not quite as good as they could be, mostly because we don't check them. Physical barriers include gates, fences, walls. We talked about all this stuff before, surveillance cameras, etc. We talked about security audits already. I told you I was going to skip through a lot of this because this is a really long deck. Security and network design. Breaches may occur due to poor LAN or WAN design, addressed through intelligent network design. Obviously, one way to protect your network is don't connect it to anything. This was Kevin Mitnick's argument about launching missiles, like they were talking about from NORAD. The reality is NORAD computers weren't or never hooked up to the internet, so there's no way to hack it. That didn't seem to make much of an argument to the government when he was arguing his case. Why? Because judges don't typically know anything about networks. So it didn't do him a lot of good as far as getting him out of solitary. But it's certainly a real issue. That's an effective way of protecting your system. Unplug it, turn it off, smash the hard drive, and you're really well protected that way. Unfortunately, it's not very useful that way. More realistic solution, restrict access at every point where the LAN connects to the outside world. So you want to firewall at all your connection points. It goes back to that story a minute ago about the wireless access point. You can control all those various connections to the outside world, but if somebody gains physical access, sets up a wireless access point, now you've got an access point that you didn't realize you had to protect against. Access control lists. They talk about it specifically in the book at the router level, and that's one place to do it. You can also do it at the wireless access point level, and we'll talk about wireless security a little bit later. But an access control list is a really nice way of trying to limit the access to your network. And the book talks about several different ways of doing it, different levels that you can control it at. You can control it at the IP level, you can control it at a variety of different levels. A common way to do it is at the MAC address. You simply identify the MAC address or the hardware address of all the various devices that are going to be on your network, input those into your access control list, and in that way, the only machines that are going to be able to log onto your network or attach to your network are the the ones that are in that database, the ones that are in that list, that access control list. So it's a way to not necessarily protect your data in terms of encrypting it. They can still potentially read your data, but they can't connect to your network. They can't send and receive data on your network. So it's one technique that you can use to help protect your system. And I would definitely recommend it. You see a lot of access points that have access control lists built into them. Just have to use them. Routers, like I said, there's a variety of different ways you can apply an access control list. Like I said, personally, I think MAC addresses are one of the easier ways of doing that. Give me an example. There's intrusion detection and intrusion prevention systems. Intrusion detection systems are very similar in nature, anyway, to virus scanners. They are typically applications that have a definition list that you download periodically that look for attack signatures. When they see an attack signature, they notify whoever it is that you've set it up to notify via email or text or however you decided to set that notification up. The downside to it is that if you're not updating your definitions, attacks change all the time. New attack techniques are applied all the time. So if you're not updating your definitions, it quickly becomes out of date and you become susceptible to those types of attacks. So it's a very reactive approach with an intrusion detection system because it waits for that attack to occur, sends out notification, and then you as a network administrator are responsible for responding in some fashion. Manually going in and configuring a router to block all IP packets from that particular IP address. Disconnecting the network, something. An intrusion prevention system goes a step forward. It can react to it, to the attack. So the downside to that is if you happen to have a false positive, you may not have a real attack, but because it perceives it as an attack, the IPS shuts down that particular port or that particular network address or whatever. So you can run into situations where legitimate traffic gets denied because of a false positive. So until you have an IPS that's correctly tuned to the traffic that's occurring on your network, you it's kind of a mixed bag as to what's good and what's not good. Okay, so firewalls, specialized device and computer installed with specialized software. Firewalls, if you talk to a guy named Bruce Schneier, which is a security guru, he basically says firewalls were the best thing ever invented, and then we threw them in the trash because we open up all the ports to allow access to all the various services that we want to allow on the internet. But once you start to open up those ports, you basically said we don't want a firewall anymore. So it's kind of a mixed bag. Having said that, I absolutely would never have a network without a firewall. It gives you a degree of protection. But the idea of a firewall is it comes to us from a firewall that you might see in a multi-home structure. It's a physical barrier that helps to restrict the fire from one part of the structure to another part of the structure. So it helps to eliminate bad traffic outside of your network from getting to the inside of your network and causing damage. And that's the concept behind a firewall. Essentially, there's two classes of firewalls. Essentially, there's two classes of firewalls. There are host-based firewalls, and then there are network-based firewalls. A host-based firewall is going to be on the individual computer. Windows firewalls is a good example. And in the vast majority of the cases, you would want both firewalls in your particular networks. The network-based firewall, a lot of times, is going to be built into your router, or you may have a dedicated hardware device, or you may have a server that's set up to act as a firewall. And that really serves as a firewall for the entire network. And the idea between having both firewalls in place is that you have a firewall at the network level, being able to protect you at your gateway, as well as individual firewalls at your individual host computers that we have. It's just, again, an extra layer of protection, or defense in depth is something that you might hear periodically. As far as the actual function of a firewall, they can function at a lot of different levels. They can operate at the application layer, for example, and block certain domains, if you will. They can operate at the packet level, looking at individual packets. They can use what they refer to as stateful packet inspection, saying that we want to examine the state of each individual packet that comes in. In other words, if we have a series of packets that come in with a sequence number, if that sequence number all of a sudden gets too far out of whack, now the state of that particular packet is suspect. It may have come from somebody else, so we're going to discard that particular packet. If it's a necessary packet, what happens? We use some of the other layers of the OSI model to retransmit that particular packet, and it will be received again. Let's see. Proxy servers can serve a similar purpose as a firewall, but in addition to providing firewall type services, proxy servers can also perform other functions. Essentially, a proxy server will act as a proxy between an internal network and an external network, such that when an internal client requests a web page, it will go to the proxy server and say, hey, I want this web page. The proxy server, in turn, then goes out to the internet and retrieves that web page and returns it to the client that requested it. To the external computer, the external web server, it's not aware of that internal computer. All it sees is that proxy server. It only thinks it's dealing with that proxy server. So the idea is that you're hiding your internal network from the external, from the internet. Something else that a proxy server allows you to do is it allows you to cache those web pages. So that as you request that web page the very first time, the next time a client on your network requests that same web page, it goes to the proxy server. The proxy server says, hey, wait a minute, I've already got a copy of that page. We don't have to go back out on the internet, request another copy of it. I've already got a copy here. So it acts like a cache server. So proxy servers really kind of provide you with a couple of different features. Not network operating system security. One of the things is to restrict user authorization, access to the server, files, and directories. Who has the right to access files, delete files, create files, read files, etc. If you start to restrict things, you can really help to protect your individual clients significantly just by not allowing clients to or individuals to install programs on their computers. Why? Because people will install anything and everything. They're just trying to get their work done. Well, if you make sure you've done a good job of identifying the various applications that your users need and have installed those properly and then locked them down, you shouldn't have those types of problems. So it becomes the analysis side that we've been talking about the whole semester really becomes very important. You identify those applications, load them into your standard image. That way all the users have all the apps that they need, then lock it down and you'll be much better off. Something else you can use at the network operating system level is the concept of groups. We want to group all of our various users by the type of users that they happen to be. So for example, instead of having a network administrator, we have a group of network administrators. Instead of having a marketing personnel, we have a group of marketing personnel. Manufacturing, a group rather than individuals in manufacturing. The idea is rather than applying specific rules to an individual user, we apply it to a group. Because now all of a sudden, if we have a change, we don't have to go change each individual user. We just change it at the group level, and that's applied to every person that happens to be a member of that group. So it's a more efficient way of assigning rights to various users. Login restrictions, we can restrict the time of the day that people log in. We can restrict how long somebody's logged in. We may have a temporary worker that comes in or an outside contractor that we want to limit how long they can log in. We can limit the source address. Maybe we only want people to be able to log in from internal addresses, so we can restrict access in that way. We can also set unsuccessful login attempts at say 3, for example. That is a technique that's particularly important. There are a lot of techniques that allow automated tools that allow hackers to attempt to access the system repeatedly by trying various passwords, dictionary attacks, brute force attacks, etc. By using a restriction where it locks the account after 3 attempts or 5 attempts or whatever, effectiveness of being able to do that, because after three attempts, it locks the account. They can't continue to attack that particular login. So it makes it much more difficult for them to really use automated tools. It doesn't make it impossible for other techniques. In fact, a very good technique is to get access in some fashion to a system, download the hash password file, and then take that file and bang away at that individual file rather than banging away on the system in which it's located. Password, choosing a secure password, guard against unauthorized access. It's by far the most widely used approach, passwords. We're very familiar with it as users. We know how passwords work. We tend to know what systems expect. So it's very easy. It's very inexpensive. It's also really problematic because we write them down. We put them on Post-it notes. We use our wife or her dog's name, or it's something that's very easy. The problem with it is it's really easy to have a very complex password that's easy to remember, and that they don't tend to go together. You don't tend to think of those two together, but the reality is it is true. Somebody give me a five-word sentence, 5 or 6 words, any sentence that's easy to remember. Say,
box.
Quick, round, box. Okay, so one of the techniques you can do is to take the first letter of each word. Now, I think most people would say 4 letters is not very secure. That's okay. So let's do something else. Let's alternate uppercase, lowercase. That's a little bit better, but it's still 4 characters. That's not very secure yet. Let's add a 1 at the end. That's good, right? You have to increment your passwords periodically. So let's put something like 1 in there that we can increment. Next time we'll make that a 2. But a lot of hacking techniques, a lot of programs, automated tools will allow them to automatically increment the last letter of a password. So you want to put something else after the 1. You don't want your increment number as the last character of your password. So put a $, put a hash sign, something. Maybe you do something more in here. Not a G, that's a Q. Right? So maybe you do T, Q, B, F, the number 0, 1, $. So now you've got a fairly good password that hopefully will be fairly easy to remember. You can take it a step further. You're supposed to have a unique password for every website here, or every account that you're logging into, right? Longer is better. Why not add somewhere in your password the name? The name of your site. Now all of a sudden you have hopefully, an easy to use password. You got your base of your password. You've got something that's unique for every site, Chase, Facebook, Home Depot, etc. So now you've got a really long password, hopefully something that's easy to remember, and something that's complex. It's something that everybody really should be able to do. You start out with a sentence that you can remember. That's the real key to it. Make sense? So passwords are a big deal. What's the solution to passwords? Well, we talk about changing frequently, do not reuse. Some of these are good, some of them are not so good. Can't remember. Yeah. People can't remember. People reset their passwords all the time. You'll hear studies periodically or read things in various trade publications that talk about how much help desk personnel spend simply resetting passwords. It's because they're not training their users. Remember we talked about earlier about educating their users and talking to their users, communicating with them? If they communicate effectively with their users, they'd be talking to them about techniques like this that would make it much easier for their users to be able to remember their passwords, not good, complex passwords. So, before I get to encryption, the idea, the big solution to that is what? How do we get away from use of passwords and make things still very effective and easy? Biometrics. Everybody knows what biometrics are? It's really promising technology, right?
The Finger Fiddlers. Adam and Jamie have just tasted success. Using a ballistics gel fingerprint, they beat the computer scanner.
Welcome, Jamie.
Hey!
That's how it works.
So next up, it's Grant's fingerprint lock that has his thumb as the master. And that's not the only difference. Unlike the computer, this scanner doesn't just read the thumbprint pattern, but it also monitors pulse, sweat, temperature, and more. Unlike the computer, this scanner doesn't just read the thumbprint pattern, but it also monitors pulse, sweat, temperature, and more. To rise to the challenge, Adam's getting hot under the collar. He's fetched the etch of Grant's covertly obtained print and has made a latex copy that he's going to plant straight onto his warm, sweaty, pulsing thumb.
Okay, so you guys ready?
Yeah, we've been working on this for days, and I think we have a couple things that might work.
Cool. Okay, well, I'll be here. All right.
Okay.
Remember, according to the manufacturers, this lock has never been broken.
All
You
right.
first.
Okay. I patented him a hard thumb.
But it's a bad start. Adam resets and tries again, but nothing. With this technique dribbling towards busted, Adam tries licking the latex. And he's in. He has set off the next alarm, but the finger's been foiled.
I don't care about the alarm. It works, man. No way.
That is latex glued to my thumb, peeled off a printed circuit board.
As far as we know, this is a world first here on Mythbusters. According to the manufacturer, that fingerprint door lock has never been beat.
But they're not stopping there.
Well, that's one down. Shall we try all of our other techniques?
Next up, it's Jamie, who's made a regular ballistics gel print of Grant's thumb. And guess what?
Hey, nicely done. That's 2 for 2. No.
At this point, the one we bought for the computer is a lot harder to break than this one.
Yeah.
Well, I say we move on to the copy paper now.
With everything they do working, the team goes for broke by trying the photocopy of Grant's print. No warmth and no pulse, just a licked piece of paper.
This is dumb. What is this? Well, there's your problem.
Yeah, you know what, the manufacturer states that this is a world's first, that no one's ever beaten this system, but, I mean, we just did it with 3 different methods in less than 10 minutes.
Actually, Adam, it took over 3 days of working your fingers to the bone. But sure, eventually, you beat it hands down.
It's a staple of modern life, going to the...
Okay. So I agree. I think biometrics is kind of the answer in the future. But don't just think biometrics will recover. Not necessarily. So certainly a possible issue. Encryption is something else the chapter talks about. Encryption uses some type of algorithm to scramble data. One of the easiest old examples to use is what's referred to as the Caesar cipher. And if you use a 13-bit or 13-character key, it's really easy. You shift your characters from A to the 13th character. That becomes your replacement for the letter A. You shift 13 characters more, you're back to A. So it's a very easy system to use. The idea is to hide information, create some type of privacy with the data, with the information actually still present. So you know there's a message that's occurring, you just don't know what it is because it's encrypted in some fashion. Encryption they refer to as the last means of defense against data theft. This is how you protect data in motion, is some type of encryption. Unfortunately, a lot of times what happens is, for example, we back up a lot of our data. A lot of times our backups don't tend to be encrypted. So even though we spend all this elaborate time encrypting our data and making sure that our stuff is encrypted in terms of transmission. We then back up our data to tape, and if you're like a good business and you're storing these tapes off-site, in a lot of cases they pay couriers to come by and pick up tapes and take those tapes off-site. Well, now it's unencrypted. If the courier is not doing a good job, those tapes can be lost or stolen, and as a result, all your data is gone. And it's a problem, obviously. Encryption provides 3 assurances. The data is not modified after the sender needs to provide 3 assurances. The data is not modified after sender transmits it. Data is viewed only by the intended recipient, and that all data received is received at the intended destination, so that it's complete. The current approaches are the use of some type of key. So we use what's referred to as key encryption. There's a couple of different approaches, but the basic terminology behind key encryption is the key itself, which is a random string of characters. The longer the key, the better. The longer the key is, the better the security we're going to have. The longer it would take for somebody to potentially break that encryption. We have ciphertext, which refers to the text or the data after it's been encrypted. Presumably unreadable, something that doesn't make sense to anybody. And then we have this concept of a brute force attack. If you don't have the key, the only thing you can do is really bang away at it. Keep guessing and guessing and guessing and guessing. That's why the longer the key, the better. The longer the key, the much more difficult this becomes to try to regenerate that key. So that kind of gives you a little example there where your message starts out, happy birthday. It's encrypted using a key. You end up with your ciphertext. You send that to the receiver. The receiver has the ciphertext. They apply the key, and they get back to the original message. In general, today we talk about 2 different types of encryption: public key versus private key encryption, asymmetric versus symmetric encryption. Private key refers to symmetric encryption. When you hear symmetric, think same. S is in symmetric, S is in same. You use the same key in public key encryption, or excuse me, in private key encryption. So you basically have a single key, or at least a single copy of a key, or a single type of key, I should say. So using that single key, both the sender and the receiver have a copy of the exact same key. That allows them to encrypt and decrypt the message. There's a couple of different formats of that. There's DES, there's triple DES. Triple DES basically uses multiple keys, and they've been around a long time. They're not that effective given modern computing, the speed of modern computing. They can be broken relatively quickly. AES is quite a bit bigger. Quite a bit better. You'll see that they have more keys. They tend to be more efficient, and so AES tends to be used quite a bit. The real issue behind private key encryption, the real advantage of private key encryption, because the same key is used, it makes the encryption and decryption process much more efficient. You can process the encryption and decryption process much more quickly. So it tends to be preferred when you have that type of situation, where you have the situation where you need to be able to process transactions, for example, very quickly. Unfortunately, you have a problem. You have to get that copy of the private key to the other person securely. Well, if you email it to them, we know email is not secure. So we really don't want to do that. We don't want to send it in the mail. We have to have a secure way of getting that copy of that key to that other person. So that becomes an issue. But we can get around that. We can, if you've got time, we can get the key, a copy of the key to both parties that are needed. The other issue when it comes to private key encryption is that what happened, presumably you don't operate in isolation. Presumably you have to talk to more than one person. So now you have to manage, if you want private conversations with all those other people, now you have to manage a lot more keys if you want to have those private conversations. You've got to keep all your keys straight. So key management becomes an issue with private key encryption. That's where public key encryption really thrives. Public key encryption attacks that problem by essentially having 2 keys, a public key and a private key. And they're exactly what they sound like. Your public key is public. It's published. People will attach it to their emails when they send out an email. It'll be listed in the public directory. So everybody has access to your public key. But your private key is private. You don't share that with anyone. It's referred to as a key pair combination. They work together. And it's also referred to as asymmetric encryption. So it requires two different keys. These keys are very tightly integrated, though. So let's see. If this particular person wants to write an email to this person, so this person wants to send an email to this person. So they're going to go out and they're going to generate their public key. They're going to store that public key on the, it might be the reverse of that. I think she's trying to write the message to him. So this guy goes out and he has creates his public key and his private key. He stores the public key on a public key server. He notifies all these other various people about his public key, so everybody knows what his public key is. Other users use that public key to encrypt a message. So I think she's sending it to him. So she ends up going out. She looks up his public key. She encrypts the message with that public key, sends him the message. The only key that will decrypt it is the private key. The public key will not, and that's the key concept behind this, the public key will not decrypt a message that's encrypted with the public key. The public key will encrypt a message from the private key. The private key will decrypt it from the public key, but the same key will not decrypt the same message. You can't decrypt the message with the same key. Does that make sense? Probably could have been worded a little bit better, but okay. So a couple of public key techniques: Diffie-Hellman, RSA, RC4. The idea behind a digital certificate has to do with that relationship between public key and private key. It's a way to have a third party that authenticates you or speaks on your behalf that this is your public key. It's what says you really are who you say you are. So essentially it's a service that you pay for from somebody like, I don't think Network Solutions does it, but there's a few parties out there that do this, that you basically pay them, they verify that you are who you say you are, and then they will issue a certificate. And that certificate contains your public key. The relationship of that with a digital signature is that what happens when we go back to that relationship there and he wants to verify to her that he really is who he says he is. What he can do, remember that relationship between public key and private key, he can encrypt a message back to her with his private key. Now what's the only key that can decrypt that? It's the public key. Well, if she can decrypt that with his public key and sees the message effectively, where did that message come from? It could only come from the person with the private key. Anybody else's private key would not have worked. So that's what a digital signature is. It's the reverse process that you would normally think of, that we would encrypt a message with a public key, private key, key pair. Pretty good privacy. We talked about earlier about email being sent in plain text. PGP is an encryption technique for email. It can actually be applied to other data as well now, but it was really designed for email and is publicly available for free. But it allows you to send and receive encrypted emails using public key infrastructure. Everybody logs into their bank securely, right? Via HTTPS. So SSL, place to go. Look for that little padlock down in the corner. If you're not, you're transmitting your stuff in plain text. So try not to do that. But the idea behind SSL is that it's going to encrypt the TCP/IP transmission. So your web pages, when you log in, you see that HTTPS protocol up there that's telling you that the information that you're sending back and forth is encrypted. And you're seeing that quite a bit. Google is actually doing that with some searches now. They have a secure version of Google that you can use. I'm not really sure why you want to do that, but you know, if that's what they want to do, I'm sure there's a reason. Let's see. Secure shell. is essentially a command prompt that you can log into a remote system and be able to issue command prompts to that system in order to be able to administer it. Secure shell is a way of being able to do that in an encrypted form. Whereas we talked about FTP earlier being in plain text, with secure shell, you can log in remotely and have that login information encrypted so that people aren't stealing your login credentials. They also have secure FTP, so you can log in securely that way. IPsec, which we talked about earlier in the semester, is a way to encrypt your messages to create a VPN across the internet, so you can have essentially the advantages of a private network across a public network such as the internet at the reduced cost that you have of accessing the internet as opposed to paying for a private network or leased lines. And then I think the chapter finishes up here talking about authentication protocols. Authentication is the process of verifying a user's credentials so that they really are who they say they are. It works very closely with authorization. We have authentication and authorization. Authorization is that this person has the rights to do X, Y, and Z, to create this file, to delete that file, to browse this directory, things like that. That's the authorization. But it all hinges on authentication. Because if you can't authenticate a user, you can't begin to authorize them or not authorize them for whatever they should be or shouldn't be authorized for. So you really need to know who they really are. Hopefully your biometrics or passwords, etc., are working properly. So it's the process of verifying a user's credentials. Authentication protocols, rules computers follow to accomplish this process of authentication. Several authentication protocol types, variable encryption scheme, and the steps taken to verify credentials. Then they talk about radius and tag services, PAP. These are just some of the basic techniques. PAP, password authentication protocol, is one of the older approaches. It doesn't get used very much anymore, mostly because it uses a two-step authentication process. It's secure, and it's really not very secure. It sends the client's credentials in clear text. So even though it's authenticating, that's great, right? We required username and password. We just opened the window and screened out our username and password, though. This is what we did. So as a result, it doesn't get used anymore. CHAP and MS-CHAP are very similar. MS-CHAP is essentially Microsoft's implementation of CHAP. Operates, again, over point-to-point protocol. Encrypts the usernames and passwords. Uses a three-way handshake. So the password is never transmitted alone. The password is never transmitted in clear text. Like I said, MS-CHAP is Windows implementation of CHAP. Talk about a particular weakness in it. Okay, talk about the Kerberos. Read through the Kerberos stuff. It's kind of interesting. I'm not that interested in you knowing all the details about Kerberos, how it works, but I do want you to kind of read a little bit and know a little bit about the background of it. Wireless network security, I think, is where the chapter actually finishes up. And to be honest with you, they could have done a better job. They should have done a better job because of the proliferation of wireless networks. They're so important in home networks and business networks. They should have had a significant portion of the book dedicated to it. Susceptible to eavesdropping. Why? Because logically it functions like a shared Ethernet connection. All the data is being broadcast for all the various clients to listen to. So if you simply change your network card to listen to promiscuous mode, you can listen to everything that's going on. So unless it's encrypted, you've got everything that you're listening to. Technique referred to as war driving comes to us actually from the old network days of war dialing, where people would take modems and they would literally set their modem up to dial number after number after number after number until it found a modem to log into. And then you noted that number. Hey, that's a modem. I can come back and hack away at that later. War driving is a more modern technique of basically just driving around with a laptop or some type of device that picks up signals and saying, hey, there's a network, there's a network, there's a network. Oh wait, that one's open, that one's open, that one's open. So it's cataloging all these open networks. I don't know about you, every time I turn my phone on, there's 2 or 3 networks in the area, just driving down the road. 802.11 itself doesn't really have security built in. The protocol itself doesn't. Essentially they ended up with kind of an afterthought, which is what WEP was, wired equivalent privacy. And it's not set up by default to be used. So as a user, when you first set up your network, you've got to enable security, at least with some of the older access points you did. One of the downsides to WEP, there's no client authentication required to communication. In other words, you don't really have to log in. Once you get that web key, you can pretty much be on the network and know what's going on. There's no authentication and verification that this really is the client who it says it is. This really is the wireless access point who it says it is. And that's important because if you go to the airport, you're trying to log into a legitimate access point, well, there may be half a dozen legitimate sounding access points. You want to make sure you log into the right one. You don't want somebody to do a man-in-the-middle attack where they provide you internet access so that they can listen in to all your communications. SSID, only item required. Even if you turn off SSID, you can still pick up SSIDs relatively easily. I would still recommend that you turn them off. It's not any significant amount of security, but every little thing that you do to make it more difficult on somebody is good. So depending on the text, some will say it's a security measure, some will say no, it's not. Anything you can do to make somebody's life more difficult is good. WEP uses a key to authenticate network clients and encrypt data in transit. Unfortunately, WEP, it tends to be it's a short key, and so it's on 64 bits originally, and it's been expanded to 128 bits and 256 bits, but it has some flaws. Part of the problem is it transmits part of the key every time it sends a transmission back and forth. And that allows a person that's trying to hack the network with enough time to be able to sit there and piece together the key. Unfortunately, wireless access points also respond to injections, and so you can actually speed up that process significantly to where within a matter of minutes to be able to access a wireless access point that's encrypted using WEP. So WEP is almost like not having any protection at all. It's better than nothing. Again, anything that you throw up it is going to be beneficial. But if you have an alternative, which almost every access point anymore would have, you'd rather use those over WEP whenever possible. Okay. Then they talk about WPA. WPA is Wi-Fi protected access. It's the successor to WEP. It was the, oh crap, we screwed up with WEP. Let's do something a little bit better. And that's what WPA was. Different type of encryption. Longer keys, much better. There's now WPA2, which is an extension beyond that. Much more secure. Something else that they didn't mention here, that they mentioned earlier in the book that I would have put here as well. Remember we talked earlier about access control lists? Use access control lists. Most wireless access points have access control lists built into them. Enter your various MAC addresses of the machines that you want to allow access. Again, that does not allow those, some other user from listening into your conversations. That's what the encryption's for. But it does prevent them from being able to access your access point and send and receive data. So at that point, with an access point, all they can do is listen in. You want to use WPA, WPA2 to actually encrypt the data, and then turn off SSID. Those are probably the main things that you can do. So that chapter, we talked a little bit about some of the stuff that I mentioned at the very beginning. Things like looking at insider threats versus outsider threats from Locke et al. And looking at the stuff from Stroud with respect to general deterrence theory. We talked about risk and auditing, security policies, Router firewalls, encryption, authentication, and wireless access points. Do some Googling, look around for some of those videos that I was showing, and other things along those lines. I would recommend that book by Kevin Mitnick too, The Ghost in the Wires. It's a really interesting book. In a lot of ways, it's exactly the same as The Art of Deception. The only difference is it's put into context in Ghost in the Wires, and you see this little kid who grew up and how he kind of got into that mindset. Again, he never, with all the credit card numbers that he stole, he never charged anything to any of them or anything like that. So he's really doing it just for the kicks of it. I think one of the things that's really interesting is once you start paying attention to these types of things, look at the names that these people are associating with, because you'll see the same names pop up over and over again. Kevin Mitnick and Steve Wozniak were pretty good friends, and the two don't strike you as people that would necessarily hang out together. One's a co-founder of Apple, this other one's a computer hacker that spends 5 years in prison. Well, the reality is they got hooked up together because of their interest in phone phreaking. So it's some really interesting stuff, and so anything you can take from YouTube videos or online or read from some of these books and stuff like that, I would definitely recommend. That's all I have for you tonight. Are there any questions over this chapter or the previous chapter?